Judge others, some say, and always do the right thing. But how can anyone determine the right thing without making a judgment? I said we'd have a bit of fun. What do I look like? You can say it. You can say what you like. We're all friends. Or I could remove this and pretend to be a cowboy, a sailor, a fireman, or my normal role, court jester. Now, I'm not going to keep that on because it looks silly. The reading talks of judgment, and how we judge other people is one of the things that we are pretty bad at times. I know I am. I'm going to recount a few stories from my days as street pastors later on, when Julie and I used to go out on the streets of Leicester, Christian group, many denominations, looking after kids between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 or 5 in the morning, just making sure they get home and they're safe and what have you. Just practical Christian help on the streets. And some of the encounters I had there. But one of the main themes of training that we had there was not to judge. And that's really hard. But I'll recount some of the stories. Would you all stand, please? Is this the type of judgment we dish out to people? Because even in a court of law, you may sit. Sorry. Even in a court of law, there's discernment. There's two sides to the argument. Yet when we sometimes meet people in the streets, we've already made a decision to walk on the other side. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way as you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. This is often misinterpreted as a prohibition against all judgment. However, Jesus is specifically warning against condemning others. The Greek word used for judgment is krino, which can mean both to discern and to condemn. Jesus urges us to avoid condemning others and instead to practice self-reflection and humility. By teaching that we'll be judged by the same standard we use to judge others, he encourages compassion over condemnation. So, what did Jesus mean by judge? Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount holds significant implications for the way we live and relate with others. So we need to go deeper into Jesus' context to understand the nuances of his judgment language. In John 3:17, we read that Jesus is not here to judge the world. But a few chapters later, Jesus says his purpose for coming to the world is for judgment. So Jesus is either making no sense, and we know that can't be true, or no, Jesus is thinking about judgment from two different angles. The word judge in Matthew chapter 7 verse 1 comes from the Greek word krino, as I've said, which can mean to discern, which is the ability to judge well in the dictionary. But it can also refer to condemnation, either in a legal court setting or in our day-to-day relationships. Paying attention to context will help us know what is meant. Is Jesus saying do not be discerning or do not be condemning? We know all too often in our news, reporters, and especially in social media, I don't call it social media, sometimes it's a poison, they can report in a way that makes a subject, whether that's a person or an issue, sound terrible by not taking care to report the context. Jesus is asking us to take care, reflect, and judge when we have taken notice of the context. So, do not judge so that you will not be judged, because with the judgment that you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure that you measure, it will be measured to you. Immediately after following verses 1 and 2, Jesus tells listeners how to approach someone who's behaving in a bad way. Why do you look at the speck of dust in your brother's eye and miss the plank in your own eye? During his time on earth, Jesus lived what he taught, and he regularly and rather assertively addressed people's harmful choices. So it wouldn't make sense for him to prohibit us from using discernment in our relationships or the world at large. Instead, in this context, Jesus uses krino to refer to condemning others or treating them with judgmental contempt. He's talking about the times we decide another person doesn't measure up. So we look down on them or think of them as a lesser person. The clown that came in earlier, we might think this is not going to tell us anything, is a fool. It's the same sort of judgment. Here's an example of condemning judgment. What happens when we condemn others without judgment? Jesus' interaction with some religious leaders who were often quick to judge can provide examples of the way God responds to our judgments of others. Consider the story of a woman who anoints Jesus with costly perfume in an alabaster jar. She kisses Jesus' feet, washes them with her tears, dries them with her hair, and finally pours the expensive fragrant liquid over them. Meanwhile, Simon, a religious leader and important person around town, watches the woman. He knows her bad reputation, and he thinks to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, that she is a sinner. Simon, like we sometimes, judges by what he can see on the outside and decides this woman is unworthy of Jesus' time and attention. His thoughts condemn her, but Jesus knows both Simon's thoughts and the woman's love that compels her brave and vulnerable act. So Jesus turns to Simon and responds to his hidden thoughts with a question. Imagine two debtors, Jesus says. One owes a lot and the other hardly anything. And the lender chooses to cancel both their debts. Of the two, who will love the lender more? I suppose the one who has the bigger debt cancelled, Simon responds. And Jesus points out that upon entering the house as a guest, Simon didn't perform any of the customary expressions of hospitality. A kiss of greeting, water to wash his feet, oil to anoint his head. But in contrast, the woman tenderly performs each of these welcoming acts with extravagant love. She recognizes her need for Jesus, and like one who is forgiven a great debt, she is compelled by her love for him. Simon, on the other hand, does not see this need for Jesus' forgiveness. In fact, his positive judgment of himself leads him to look down on the woman and wrongly condemn her. This is exactly the type of contempt Jesus has in mind when he tells his followers not to judge one another. And Jesus' response to Simon highlights what he meant by lest ye be judged. Jesus turns Simon's critical thoughts around and directs them back like a mirror towards his own life. Simon is so busy counting the woman's flaws that he overlooks his own lack of love and his need for Jesus. With his reply, Jesus lovingly and firmly holds Simon to account for playing God and using unequal standards to justify himself whilst condemning the woman. With examples like Simon, we can start to understand why Jesus gives the do not judge command. But what about the more basic act of judging light from dark or good from bad? Immediately after teaching people to never judge, condemn one another, Jesus uses the striking word picture to describe how his followers should approach each other over issues that require careful discernment. Why do you see the speck in the eye of your brother, but don't perceive the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, allow me to take out the speck from your own eye, and look, the plank is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take out the plank from your own eye, and then you can clearly see the speck in the eye of your brother. Jesus' words suggest that there is time and place to speak up when we see a problem. Like Jesus, we can call out wrongdoings in ways that do not condemn or even diminish others. But notice that it isn't until the final line of this metaphor that Jesus says anything about assessing another person's behavior. The majority of his instruction is about the important first step of self-reflection. Remember Jesus' response to Simon. Jesus redirects Simon's evaluative thoughts inward, pointing out that Simon needs to address his own issues, the metaphorical plank in his own eye, before he turns to evaluate someone else's speck or bad behavior. Recognizing, acknowledging, and addressing our own failures is a humbling process. Just like the woman who wept at Jesus' feet, we are reminded of our deep need for God. From this place of honest humility, we are less likely to judgmentally condemn or think less of others. The Jesus follower approaches all others humbly and gently, always operating from a posture of forgiveness and grace. Rather than being driven by a sense of self-importance, this kind of person's motivation comes from the love Paul describes in Corinthians, a love that believes all things and hopes all things, choosing to respect every human being as miraculous, beloved creation of God. So what might the consequences of judging others be? Jesus is clear that his followers should not engage in condemning judgment towards others. And throughout his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about how clearly he sees our inner motivations, the hidden realities that shape our lives in a way that no one else can. He takes into account our grief, our disappointment, our desire to be noticed, our worry about the future, and our sincere desire to please God. So when we look down on another person, we act as though we can see their inner realities just as clearly. We end up playing God. And we know from the beginning of the whole story in Genesis, that doesn't work very well. Remember how humans bring corruption and death upon themselves, precisely because they try to determine right and wrong apart from God, according to what is good or bad in their own eyes. In Genesis and in Jesus' teaching, we can hear God saying, "You do not have what it takes to make judgments on your own. I have made you with everything it takes to love one another deeply, so keep doing that and leave the judging part to me." Now, coming back to times of my street pastoring days, I certainly don't miss the long nights getting back home at 5 o'clock in the morning, but I do miss the buzz of being on the streets with people. The times when we've had people notice what the church is doing on the streets and are very, very grateful for us being there. Especially when we hand out free flip-flops to young ladies that have been on high heels that you need a stepladder to get on. We are called the flip-flop guys at times. But it's when you part the way through talking to somebody on the streets and you've judged the situation before you get to them, or you try not to judge it, but you think, gosh, I'm not going to be adequate enough to do this. You realize that when you're talking, Jesus is standing here, right alongside you, helping you talk, helping you guide others. And then best of all, when the situation concludes, knowing that your eyes have been opened and there's this feeling of awe. There are many occasions I can recount. 2 I will give to you. When I was first starting as street pastor, it was a bit unnerving when you've got a group of about 20 young men shouting and yelling behind you, and they're walking toward you. They see street pastor emblazoned on your jacket, and you get called everything from pasty to pastel to pope. Everything gets thrown at you. It's all a Mickey take. So you're worried. See, in your mind, you're thinking, there's going to be an encounter here. They gather round you, take the Mickey out of you, and walk on. One of the lads hang back. He stayed with us. And we had a good conversation with him as we were walking along about what we do and about church. And he wanted to know. His friends were telling him, come on, get away from them. You don't need to talk to them. But he insisted. And they waited for him in the distance as he talked to us. And it was a golden moment of just telling him what Jesus is to us, why we do that work. And he went away feeling very happy that there were people on the streets that would help him out later on when he got a bit more than merry. Another occasion, sometimes we used to buy a burger and a coffee or a hot chocolate from McDonald's, which is open 24 hours, for the homeless. Now, you can judge whether they're homeless or whether they're just professional beggars. But we didn't do that. We tried not to do that because who would want to sit on a street in the rain in the middle of winter? So you use a bit of benefit of doubt. And we used to buy these things. And at McDonald's, I don't know whether you've ever been to this salubrious restaurant called McDonald's. You go in and you order on this computer, which takes me an age to work out. Then you get a ticket and wait for it to come. When your number's called, you get your thing. And as I was waiting, there was a homeless guy sitting in a booth, all on his own, waving me toward him. And I thought, no, I've got to get my burger, and I've got to do that. Yeah, so anyway, I went over to talk to him. And he was in tears because on that particular day, a group of young people had been in town, not street pastors, another church, and prayed with him and prayed for him. And nobody had ever done that for him before. And he was in floods of tears. So we prayed for him in McDonald's. And then he said, thank you for that. He says, I'll let you get on with getting whatever you've got to get. And that encounter, I never know what happened to him, but he was touched that day by somebody praying for him. That they didn't judge him. They went straight to him, sat down with him on the pavement and prayed with him, which really struck home with him. It's really humbling to hear people that have encountered God and hopefully their lives get better. We can only pray that that's the case. So it's a golden rule, isn't it, not to judge? Imagine living in a world where everyone treats everyone else in thought and deed the way that we all want to be treated, with fairness, kindness, generosity, and love. Rather than sizing one another up, trying to determine who's better or who's worse, who is good or who is bad. We instead choose to love one another because that's how we want to be treated. It isn't easy, but it's not impossible. How would following this golden rule change the way we judge others? What happens then, rather than being quick to judge, we're instead quick to wonder, how do I want people to approach me when I drop the ball and fail? Operating from this angle will temper our responses, increase our wisdom, and most importantly, draw us deeper into strong bonds of mutual love with our neighbours. The Golden Rule helps us to follow through on God's greatest commandment, to love God and love all others with everything we've got. When Jesus says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged," He's not saying that all judgment is wrong. He's calling people to a new and better way of dealing with one another. Instead of judgmentally condemning or looking down on each other, we can operate with the power of divine mercy that heals what is broken. With Jesus, we can practice the golden rule, approaching others with the same dignity and respectful love. Amen.